Okay, Josh, agenda item number 5 is approved application FP 2021-03 final plat for Logistics Park, Kansas City, LPKC, 5th plat, generally located north of 187th Street between Kill Creek Road and Waverly Road, Edgerton, Kansas. So, what do you got?
I'd like to remove it. It was brought to my attention today that I have a conflict of interest with those land cattle. I've talked with the city attorney, and I don't want to be in that conflict of interest.
And I can jump in there because I was the one who contacted them, and I don't necessarily think you have one, but there was a claim that you had one, and so I want to make sure that we deal with that. I was just thinking here that last month, and really 2 months ago, Clay and I were joking last 2 meetings that I haven't spoken very much, so now you're going to really get tired of me. There you go. I'll make up for my previous conversation. There you go. You're welcome. So it was, you know what? This will help me because I speak fast, and that way you won't have to try to figure me out. I received an email yesterday from the mayor about a possible conflict involving Councilmember Boone, and it was from Councilmember Stambach. You know what? I want to make sure you guys understand it. And I appreciate, especially as a new council member, that you understand this is a perfect process to bring this up. It was brought to the mayor's attention. The mayor then forwarded it on to me. That allowed me to see how we needed to deal with it. Just so that the council and the public is aware, this was the request that was made to the mayor. Mayor Roberts, I'm sending this email in hopes for clarity and resolution. As you are aware, Joshua Beam is currently living in a North Point-owned home, which was not zoned for residential dwelling. I've contacted several people, including the attorney for the Ethics Committee, and was instructed to also contact the Johnson County DA, as this is a conflict of interest. I've been asked by several residents why this would be allowed, and I'm bringing this issue to you prior to contacting the DA and city attorney. Is or has Joshua Beam filed for recusal for himself where North Point is concerned? I believe this would be a legal way to prevent a conflict of interest case. I was given reference numbers according to recusal of a councilman and why this would be relevant in this case. It says 754303, which is KSA 754303, which I'll get to in a minute, requires him to file a report of interest. An individual listed as a local officer or appointed official who has taken a part of a contract with someone who has substantial interest would be someone who would have an obligation to recuse himself. A question asked by the attorney was, has there been a public bid or motion in this case? Joshua, to my knowledge, should have filed disclosure statements of substantial interest regarding him leasing property from a developer in which he votes on. This email is my suggestion on having him file an emergency recusal regarding North Point. I hope I hear from you prior to the meeting, although I'm willing to openly discuss this as it is a public concern. Thank you, Josie Stambach. So I received this yesterday and contacted Josh today. I want to make sure first that the council is aware that there is nothing in the city code, our governing documents, which require any sort of regulatory interest or penalty for a conflict of interest. There's nothing in your code that says, in the event of a conflict of interest, you do X, or the following are conflicts of interest under Edgerton City Code. So I contacted Josh and just said, look, first and foremost, this is your call, not the council's, but I'd like to have this information since this was raised so I can bring it to the council's attention and bring it to the public attention if that is in fact who it was that was concerned with this issue. So I contacted Josh. He stated earlier that you rent a property from North Point. You rent a property from Hillsdale Land and Cattle, LLC. He has a written 1-year lease with that entity, wherein he pays monthly rent to that entity. I asked him, have you received any benefit, any payments, any sort of consideration from them? Josh's answer was no. I asked him, have you paid rent every month? And his answer was yes. I didn't ask him if it was timely, but I'm going to assume it was on time. So he told me he was in the process of getting receipts for that, and sent me the lease, and I was able to review the lease. I then pulled up the documents that I have in front of you. Again, not because there's anything within the city code that requires it, but to allow you guys to understand the statutory reference that was made in Councilmember Stambaugh's email and how it applies to this situation. Hopefully, you all are aware that you have a requirement to file a notice of substantial interest with the county. Again, it is not filed with the city. It is filed with the county when you become a council member. What that document discusses is these types of possible conflicts of interest. That form has on it certain, and I'll have these in front of you here in a minute, certain items that determine this is a substantial interest. So grab your glasses and look with me here at the document. You'll see I numbered them all on the bottom right. This is the first one here, and it's the longest, I promise. And it is defining what a substantial interest is, which is important as we look at the rest of this. There are 5 items that fall under the term substantial interest. The first one is if an individual or an individual spouse, either individually or collectively, has owned within the preceding 12 months a legal or equitable interest exceeding $5,000 or 5% of any business, whichever is less, the individual has substantial interest in that business. Now, there is no claim, and Josh has no interest in Hillsdale Land and Cattle, so 1 would not apply to this situation. 2, if an individual or individual spouse, either individually or collectively, has received during the preceding calendar year compensation which is or will be required to be included as taxable income on federal income tax returns of the individual and spouse in an aggregate amount of $2,000 from any business or combination of businesses, the individual has a substantial interest in that business or combination of businesses. Again, in our conversations, and Josh, you can state for the record, have you received any income in an aggregate amount of $2,000 from any business or combination of businesses that the city has dealt with on a contractual basis? No. I'm going to skip 3, and you'll understand why in a minute. We'll go to 4. If an individual or an individual spouse holds the position of officer, director, associate, partner, or proprietor of any business other than the organization exempt from federal taxation of the corporations under, and you'll see all that, I won't read that all out, the individual has a substantial interest in that business, irrespective of the amount of compensation received. Again, Josh does not hold a position of officer, director, associate, or partner, or proprietor in any business that the city has or looks to be tonight voting on. Is that correct?
Yes.
5 is if an individual or an individual spouse receives compensation, which is a portion or percentage of each separate fee or commission paid to a business or combination of businesses, the individual has a substantial interest in any client or customer who pays fees or commissions to the business or combination of businesses from which fees or commissions the individual or the individual spouse, either individually or collectively, receive an aggregate of $2,000 or more in the preceding calendar year. Again, I asked Josh that question. He said he had no conflict of that nature. The reason I skipped 3 is not because it applies, but it's the closest one were someone to claim that it did. 3, if an individual or an individual spouse, either individually or collectively, has received in the preceding 12 months, without reasonable or valuable consideration, goods or services having an aggregate value of $500 or more from a business or combination of businesses, the individual has a substantial interest. This is key because this would seemingly to me, based on the email, be the area that would make sense for someone claiming there was some agreement that occurred that did not involve consideration. Consideration being, I provide a service, you provide payment. That is the consideration. Here, it's I provide a residence, Hillsdale Cattle provides a residence, Josh provides payment for that residence. I asked him, was that quid pro quo occurring? Yes. Was there any services provided above and beyond that which you paid for? He said, no, it was a normal lease. Is that all correct from what you told me? Have you received anything, $500, well, anything beyond rent for, paying rent for a residence? And your answer to me was no. So the only reason I set that one aside, as you'll notice, those are the 5 items that determine whether you have a substantial interest in, that we're talking about for that form. The only thing I could think of, because then I had to go, okay, is there any possibility under that there could be a claim of substantial interest? The only thing I could come up with was if he has his lease, and if he decided to transfer his interest in that lease, right, sublet, to some other party, it is possible he could do that. I have this lease, I have the ability to transfer it, I want $1,000 for it. That could trigger an amount above $500. But the written lease has a non-assignment, non-sublet clause. So I'm bringing you, my job, as you guys know, and I've driven you nuts for a few years on this, is worst case scenario, how do we find it? That was the only way I could come up with it. And that can occur because of the language in the lease. So we go then to the next document that I've titled number 2, which is 754304. No local government officer or employee shall, in the capacity of such an officer, make or participate in the making of a contract with any person or business by which the officer or employee is employed or has a substantial interest. Again, based on my review of the situation, I don't believe there is any substantial interest based on this, but I want to point this out because it will put a bow on it here in a minute. B, no person or business shall enter into a contract where any local government officer or employee acting in that capacity is a signatory to or a participant in the making of the contract and is employed by or has a substantial interest in the person or business. And lastly, C, a local government officer or employee does not make or participate in the making of the contract if the officer or employee abstains from any action in regard to the contract. So that makes sense. If he abstains from a vote involving that contract, he would not have any substantial interest there. 754305, this kind of comes back to what it is that you guys are all required to do. Any local government officer or employee who has not filed a disclosure of substantial interest shall, before acting upon any matter which will affect any business in which the officer or employee has a substantial interest, file a written report of the nature of the interest with the county election officer of the county in which it is located, all or the largest geographical part of the officer or employee's governmental subdivision. The reason I include 754304, page 2, and 754305, page 3, has to do with page 4, 754306. What is the penalty for violation of this substantial interest doctrine? Violation of 754304, which is page 2, entering into a contract, and 754305, page 3, failing to file that substantial interest, or failure to make any disclosure of substantial interest as required by 754302 is a Class B misdemeanor. Okay? So, if he makes disclosure of his situation, which he has done, disclose that he has a lease with this party, he gets past the third one. He hasn't failed to make disclosure. Now, again, my advice on this, my review of this, is there is no substantial interest. But even if there were, he has made that known to all of you in the public this evening, that this is the nature of my agreement with that party.